I noticed my off-grid power bills creeping higher for months, and at first, I blamed equipment glitches or a faulty meter. But then I saw something impossible, signs that someone had been siphoning electricity directly from my system. My secluded mountain cabin, far from neighbors, wasn't supposed to have anyone near it. Yet someone had found a way in. When I confronted her, Karen, the neighbor I thought I could trust, she did the unthinkable. She called the cops on me. How could someone get away with stealing my power and turn the law against me? What happened next changed everything. Before all the chaos, life on my mountain property was quiet, steady, and exactly what I had been craving. Years of city living had left me craving isolation, space, and the kind of peace you can only find far from streetlights, traffic, and nosy neighbors. My off-grid cabin wasn't fancy, just solar panels on the roof, a small wind turbine on a hill, and a generator tucked into the back shed. But it was mine, fully self-sufficient, and entirely under my control. Every sunrise over the ridge felt like a reward. Every evening with the glow of lanterns a small victory over the chaos of modern life. The area itself was sparsely populated. Houses were scattered across the slopes, and trails wound through the dense forest that surrounded us. Most neighbors kept to themselves, sharing occasional greetings or small talk at the local store. I had built routines. Checking the solar arrays in the mornings, monitoring my battery output, hiking a few trails before settling in to work on writing projects or planning upgrades to the cabin. Life here demanded responsibility, but it rewarded independence, and I thrived on that balance. One neighbor, Karen, lived down the hill. She was the type who always knew everyone's business, even in a community designed to allow privacy. She'd pop up with casual questions about power setups or water sources, or offer unsolicited advice about community regulations, even though this wasn't an HOA-run area. At first, I brushed it off. Isolation often attracts busybodies, and Karen seemed harmless. A little nosy, a little dramatic, but mostly harmless. Yet small signs started creeping in. A question about whether my generator was properly permitted. Casual comments about how everyone shares resources out here. Almost jokingly, but with a tone that hinted at ownership beyond her own property. A friendly knock that seemed a little too eager to peek at my solar panels. Nothing overt, nothing threatening, just the faintest sense that someone was quietly watching, quietly waiting. I paid it little mind. After all, the mountain was big, my property was mine, and my systems were secure. I was confident in my independence. But in retrospect, those small signs were the early tremors of a storm I had no idea was brewing. A storm that would test not only my patience and resolve, but the very notion of privacy and a trust in a place where independence was supposed to be sacred. The mountain that had promised peace was about to teach me a lesson in vigilance, entitlement, and the unexpected lengths some people will go to get what doesn't belong to them. The first inkling that something was seriously wrong came when I noticed my solar battery readings acting funny. At first, I assumed a technical glitch, a cloudy week or a miscalibrated meter. But the numbers didn't add up. My system was showing energy usage far beyond anything I had drawn, even when all devices were powered down. At first, I chalked it up to miscalculations. Then came the evening's lights flickering in the cabin, subtle surges in the generator display, and a faint hum running through the wiring that shouldn't have been there. I walked the property, scanning for damaged wiring, faulty panels, or even animals chewing through lines. Everything looked normal, but the feeling of unease settled deep in my gut. There was someone else using my power, someone tapping into my system without my permission. My off-grid haven, my sanctuary, was being invaded in the most invasive, imperceptible way. The realization hit harder than any obvious theft could. Unlike a stolen item you can see, electricity is invisible. Its theft leaves no fingerprints, only consequences. Someone had figured out how to siphon power directly from my solar array without alerting my alarms. And whoever it was, they were bold. They weren't just making off with a little energy. They were systematically draining months of output. It didn't take long to identify the culprit. Karen, my so-called neighbor down the hill, had a habit of checking in on my systems under the guise of curiosity. She'd ask questions about panels, meters, and storage batteries that now seemed pointedly strategic. Subtle inquiries that, at the time, I dismissed as nosiness, now screamed like red flags in neon. Someone who lives downhill, casually inquiring about your power setup, in a cabin fully off-grid. That's a person scouting opportunity. I started monitoring more closely. I rigged temporary sensors and ran logs of usage. Within days, the pattern was undeniable. Every time I left the property or went to bed at night, energy spikes occurred, coinciding with Karen's presence downhill. Her home, seemingly innocuous, was wired to siphon off my power. Months of excess usage explained the elevated bills and stressed batteries. She had been doing this under my nose the entire time. The first confrontation happened quietly. I walked down the slope, careful to avoid detection, and caught her at a junction where I had installed temporary meters and diversion points. She looked up, startled, as the flashlight caught her tinkering with wires that led from my array into her home. Her eyes widened. For a brief second, I imagined she might apologize, might realize the gravity of her actions. But instead, she stiffened, a defensive flash crossing her face, the kind that speaks of entitlement and denial. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply told her she had no right to be siphoning power, that this was theft, and that I had documentation. Her response was something I never expected. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911. I froze for a moment, stunned. She was calling the cops. On me. The person she had just been caught stealing from. The audacity was breathtaking. Within minutes, she was waving them down, creating her own narrative of harassment. While I stood calmly, knowing I had evidence. The next several days were a whirlwind. Deputies came to the cabin, and I calmly walked them through the system, showing logs, sensor readings, and video captures I had managed to rig. Karen presented her story, claiming intimidation and false accusations. She leaned heavily on her perceived authority as a longtime resident, and the idea that I was isolated and reactive, implying that any concern I voiced was overblown. But facts don't lie. The deputies inspected the wiring. They traced the siphon. They saw where energy had been redirected illegally from my panels. I had months of logs, photographs, and corroborated patterns showing she had exploited my systems repeatedly. The officers were professional, but the absurdity of the situation was clear. A neighbor, caught stealing power, trying to reverse the accusation. It was almost comedic if it weren't so frustrating. Once the initial visit was complete, I knew the danger wasn't over. Karen had the ability to manipulate perception. Her calls to authorities had already planted seeds with other locals who only saw what she framed. Me confronting her on her own property. It was petty, it was manipulative, and it was dangerously close to turning the law against me, even though she was the one breaking it. In the weeks that followed, I escalated my defenses. I installed cameras with night vision, motion sensors, and redundant logging to track every watt leaving my system. I documented every encounter, every attempt she made to justify her actions, and every call she placed to authorities. Every piece of evidence had to be airtight, because in a small, isolated mountain community, perception can be as dangerous as reality. Karen, sensing the walls closing in, became bolder. She started tampering more directly. She climbed poles, accessed junction boxes, and tried to bypass newly installed locks. Each attempt left traces: bent connectors, frayed insulation, and sometimes fingerprints that could be photographed. Her arrogance grew as she miscalculated my awareness. The more desperate she became, the more reckless her thefts. At one point, she escalated further. I had a neighbor report that she had been approaching multiple cabins along the ridge, asking technical questions about power usage, just to compare systems, she claimed. It was clear she was mapping other off-grid setups, perhaps to expand her theft network. That's when the tension shifted from my property alone to a potential threat to the entire hillside community. I started tracking her movements from my cabin when I wasn't physically present. Long-range cameras, night sensors, and energy logs revealed a terrifying pattern. She was systematic. She knew exactly when I was away, when batteries were high, and when solar panels were producing peak energy. She had learned my routines, studied my setup, and adapted to avoid detection. Every move I made was countered, every security upgrade tested. During this period, the community began whispering. Some neighbors noticed the unusual activity: lights flickering late at night, her visits, the subtle humming that came from lines where it shouldn't. But they hesitated to intervene. Off-grid life is private. Outsiders interfere at their own risk. Karen, cunning as she was, leveraged that hesitation to her advantage. She painted herself as a concerned resident, making sure everyone's energy systems were up to code. While casting doubt on my intentions, the psychological strain grew. Every time I left the property, I worried about the next intrusion. Every call, every knock, every flicker of the lights became a potential threat. The sanctuary I had built over years, painstakingly self-sufficient and secure, was now a battleground. My independence, the very thing I valued most, felt under siege. Then came the day when she tried to go even further. I had upgraded the wiring junctions with tamper-proof boxes, expecting a temporary lull after the initial confrontations. But Karen, emboldened by her belief that I couldn't prove long-term theft, managed to force access. I returned from a brief hiking trip to find my system partially disabled, wires bent, sensors bypassed. She had learned to manipulate not just energy lines, but perception. If she could disable the system briefly, she could claim technical problems when challenged. That was the tipping point. I realized this was no longer a neighborly dispute. It was a premeditated, ongoing theft, coupled with attempts to manipulate law enforcement and community perception. Her audacity, the months of careful planning, and the risk she posed to both property and personal safety could no longer be ignored. The next days were a calculated preparation for confrontation. I meticulously documented everything, every spike in power usage, every tampering attempt, every false report she filed. I prepared a detailed record for the authorities, for neighbors, and for myself, ensuring that when the confrontation happened, it would be clear who was in the right. And then, it finally arrived. The moment where all months of tension, fear, and frustration would converge. I had tracked her one last attempt to siphon power late one night. As she climbed the hill to access my junction boxes, I triggered my sensors to record her movements, logged the energy diversion, and waited, knowing the final confrontation was imminent. In that quiet mountain night, every shadow, every footstep, and every whisper of wind felt magnified. Months of her schemes, her audacity, her manipulation, and her attempts to turn the law against me were about to collide with the truth, and the result would set the stage for a showdown that neither of us would forget. A climax where control, entitlement, and justice would finally collide. The question hanging in the night was simple but chilling. Would Karen be stopped before she did irreparable damage? Or would her audacity escalate beyond what I could handle alone? The night I caught Karen red-handed, the mountain felt alive with tension. The wind whispered through the pines, masking the quiet hum of my off-grid systems. Every sensor I had installed over months was blinking, recording, logging, and ready to tell the truth. Months of her manipulation, theft, and attempts to twist the law in her favor were about to collide with reality. And I was finally in a position to confront it head-on. I watched from the ridge as she approached the junction box I had reinforced days earlier. Her movements were deliberate, cautious, yet confident. She believed her months of careful theft had left her untouchable. That confidence would become her downfall. I activated the external cameras and motion sensors I had strategically placed, capturing every step, every hand movement, every glance she cast toward the property line. For the first time, I felt in full control, not just of the situation, but of the narrative she had tried so hard to manipulate. As I descended toward the box, flashlight in hand, Karen froze mid-motion. The beam caught the glint of tools in her hands, and for a fleeting moment, I saw genuine fear. A recognition that her game was up. She dropped her wrench slightly, attempting to hide it behind her back, but the evidence was undeniable. Every camera angle recorded the theft. Every sensor confirmed her presence on my lines. Every log I had meticulously kept for months validated what was happening before my eyes. "Karen," I said firmly, my voice cutting through the night, calm but carrying authority. "Step away from my property. You're stealing electricity, tampering with equipment, and breaking the law. I have documentation of everything." Her response was immediate and predictably desperate. She pulled out her phone and began dialing. I knew exactly what she intended. Calling the authorities to frame herself as the victim, to paint me as the aggressor. But I wasn't intimidated. I had prepared for this moment. I had gathered every scrap of evidence, every log, every sensor alert, every photograph of her prior attempts, every note she had left behind in her feigned visits. While she fumbled with her phone, I called the sheriff's non-emergency line, calmly stating the situation and providing precise GPS coordinates. My report wasn't just a complaint, it was a full dossier ready for law enforcement action. Within minutes, deputies were en route, and I stayed on the line, narrating events as they unfolded. Karen's panic became palpable. She had spent months thinking she could manipulate perception, dodge accountability, and get away with theft under the radar. But now, in the silence of the mountain night, her illusion crumbled. She waved at the cameras, tried to adjust her story, and even gestured toward me as if to imply provocation. It was pitiful, and yet infuriating. Months of audacity had led to this. A confrontation where her own actions would betray her. The first deputies arrived just as Karen hung up. They approached cautiously, assessing both her nervous gestures and my calm, commanding presence. I handed them the compiled evidence. Screenshots from the sensors, energy logs, camera footage showing her tampering, and timestamps matching my own absence periods. The deputies watched the footage. Their expressions shifted from professional neutrality to subtle disbelief. In real time, they saw her cross the boundary of my property, manipulate the junction box, and siphon electricity. There was no ambiguity. No, he said, she said. It was clear, undeniable proof of criminal activity. Karen tried to explain herself, waving her arms and talking over the deputies, claiming she was merely checking the safety of the lines. Or that I shouldn't have accused her without proof. But every word was contradicted by the evidence before them. Every explanation she offered sounded feeble, rehearsed, desperate. The deputies took notes, asked direct questions, and her answers unraveled almost immediately. Then came the most humiliating moment for her. The arrival of neighbors, who had been quietly observing from the ridge, alerted by the lights and unusual activity. They witnessed her standing there, phone in hand, attempting to maintain authority and credibility while the evidence stacked against her. Whispers spread through the small gathering, disbelief turning to astonishment, astonishment turning to judgment. Karen's bravado crumbled completely, as one neighbor quietly remarked. "So this is what you've been doing all these months?" Her face went pale, her attempts to justify vanished, and the sheer absurdity of her situation sank in. She had spent months thinking she controlled the narrative. In an instant, the narrative controlled her. The deputies escorted her to the edge of my property, reviewing the legal implications of her actions. Every theft, every tampering, every false accusation she had filed against me for perceived harassment now formed a clear pattern. It wasn't a simple dispute anymore. It was a criminal act with multiple counts, including theft of utilities, trespassing, and attempted obstruction. I stood back, observing, as Karen's calculated entitlement dissolved in real time. The power she thought she wielded over perception, over law, over neighbors, vanished. And for the first time in months, I felt the tension lift, replaced by a sharp sense of vindication. But there was still one final confrontation. A more personal one. Karen, realizing her legal strategies had failed, attempted one last maneuver of verbal appeal to shame me in front of the deputies and neighbors. She tried to paint herself as a concerned resident, claiming my harsh accusations and over-the-top surveillance were harassment, attempting to shift guilt back onto me. I remained calm, methodical, and precise. Every claim she made had already been disproven by the evidence in their hands. I walked them through the logs. The nights she siphoned power, the timestamps, the tampered junction boxes, and the photographs of her repeated attempts. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The documentation spoke louder than any argument. The deputies nodded, making clear that they understood the pattern and the premeditated nature of her actions. They confirmed that she had attempted to manipulate law enforcement by calling 911, but the truth was irrefutable. Every tactic she had used to evade accountability only strengthened the case against her. The final humiliation came when the sheriff pointed out that the surveillance cameras I had set up weren't just recording for my own protection. They were evidence of her repeated violations over months. Karen's attempts to frame herself as the victim had completely backfired. Every neighbor witnessing this knew exactly what had happened. The whispers of concern, the slight nods, the raised eyebrows, they all spoke volumes. In the span of one night, Karen went from bold and arrogant to exposed and powerless. Her months of theft, manipulation, and attempts to intimidate were dismantled piece by piece. The mountain air, once silent and calm, now carried the heavy weight of justice being served in real time. Even as the deputies prepared the necessary paperwork to file formal charges, I felt the emotional release of months of tension. My cabin, my systems, my independence, all had been threatened, but none had been truly compromised. Karen's attempts to undermine them had failed spectacularly. And in that quiet moment, I realized that the confrontation wasn't just about stopping theft, it was about reclaiming control over my life, my property, and my peace of mind. The night stretched on as statements were taken, evidence cataloged, and Karen's exposure cemented. Her attempts at manipulation and entitlement would leave a permanent mark on the small community. A lesson in audacity gone wrong. Meanwhile, the deputies assured me that the case would move forward swiftly, with multiple charges and a clear record of her repeated criminal actions. As I walked back toward the cabin after the confrontation, the wind rustled through the trees, almost as if the mountain itself had exhaled. The tension that had been building for months, subtle, creeping, and insidious, had finally been released. The thief who had exploited my systems, tried to manipulate the law, and tested my patience had been stopped. But even in victory, I couldn't ignore the lesson the night had delivered. Karen's boldness had escalated slowly, quietly, over months, exploiting trust, ignorance, and opportunity. One lapse, one oversight, could have resulted in her success. The entire ordeal underscored how carefully one must protect boundaries, document interactions, and act decisively when rights are being violated. The climax wasn't just about catching her in the act. It was about the culmination of preparation, patience, and resolve. Months of careful monitoring, strategic planning, and calm confrontation had turned what could have been an untraceable crime into an undeniable victory. Every sensor, every log, every camera angle contributed to a decisive turning point, and the truth had been undeniable. And as Karen was led away, handcuffed and flustered, the final, chilling thought lingered in my mind: the mountain had once been a sanctuary, a place of peace and independence. That sanctuary had been threatened, violated, and tested. But in the end, it had endured. And the lesson was clear: when someone oversteps, no amount of audacity or manipulation can stand against preparation, documentation, and steadfast resolve. The night ended with one final realization. The confrontation might be over, but the consequences of her actions were only beginning. And justice, meticulous and unyielding, would follow her for months to come. The question that hung in the cool night air, echoing among the pines, was simply: what happens when entitlement meets accountability, and audacity collides with someone who refuses to back down? The aftermath of that night settled over the mountain slowly, but the effects were immediate and undeniable. Karen, once bold and entitled, was now reduced to a cautionary tale, whispered among neighbors. The arrest had sent ripples through the small community. A stark reminder that audacity has limits, and that no one, no matter how confident, is above accountability. For me, the weeks that followed were a mixture of relief, reflection, and careful rebuilding. The storm of months-long theft had passed, but the lessons it delivered were far-reaching. First came the legal proceedings. Karen's actions were more than petty theft; they were premeditated, repeated, and brazen. The documentation I had compiled, energy logs, camera footage, timestamps, and sensor alerts, left little room for argument. The sheriff's department worked quickly, and the case moved through the system with unusual speed for such a remote area. The charges included theft of utilities, trespassing, tampering with electrical equipment, and attempted obstruction of law enforcement. Each charge carried significant weight, but together they painted an unmistakable portrait of deliberate, calculated wrongdoing. Her initial arrogance had evaporated. During hearings, she tried to defend herself, weaving stories of curiosity and neighborly concern. But the evidence was damning. Even the defense attorneys struggled to make a coherent case. Months of her manipulations, calls to the authorities to portray herself as a victim, and attempts to intimidate me were laid bare in court. Judges and prosecutors alike were astonished. Not just by the theft, but by the audacity of trying to reverse blame on the rightful owner. While the legal system sorted itself out, the community itself underwent a quiet transformation. Neighbors who had once ignored subtle breaches of property or boundary began to take notice of their own systems. Conversations shifted from casual greetings to cautious awareness. The mountain, once a haven of isolation and independence, had revealed a vulnerability none of us had fully appreciated. Residents began sharing tips, monitoring their own lines, and discussing preventative measures. And slowly, the culture shifted from passive tolerance to proactive vigilance. The emotional impact on me was more complicated. Relief was tempered with residual frustration. For months, my sanctuary had been compromised, my routines disrupted, my peace of mind violated. I realized that living off-grid doesn't just require physical infrastructure. It demands constant vigilance, not just against technical failures, but against human ambition and entitlement. Yet, despite the intrusion, there was also an immense sense of satisfaction. I had faced months of theft, deception, and intimidation, and had emerged not just intact but vindicated. The restoration of my property became a meticulous project. I inspected every panel, cable, and junction. I upgraded security measures, reinforcing tamper-proof boxes and adding redundancy to my sensors. Each improvement was a small victory, a tangible step in reclaiming control over the space I had painstakingly built. The process was painstaking but necessary. It was not just about protecting energy, but about restoring a sense of trust in my environment. The mountain home, once violated, now felt secure again. Karen's legal consequences reverberated far beyond the courtroom. The arrests and charges served as a stark warning to anyone considering exploiting others' property. Friends, family, and neighbors shared news of the case widely. Within months, her reputation was irrevocably damaged. No amount of social posturing or attempted explanation could undo the public record or the community's knowledge of her actions. She had crossed a line, and the consequences were permanent. I also realized the importance of preparation and documentation. Without months of careful monitoring, evidence collection, and strategic planning, Karen might have succeeded, or at least muddied the narrative enough to evade accountability. Every sensor, every log, every camera angle contributed to building an airtight case. The experience reinforced that vigilance is not paranoia. It is essential when dealing with neighbors who may overstep boundaries, whether out of greed, curiosity, or entitlement. Over time, the story became a reference point in the community. People shared it not just as gossip but as a cautionary tale. Off-grid living demands independence, yes, but it also requires awareness, legal understanding, and proactive protection. Conversations shifted from casual discussions about trails and sunrise views to practical discussions about securing power, protecting property lines, and documenting interactions. In that sense, the incident had a ripple effect far beyond my own property. It raised awareness and increased accountability across the ridge. There were also personal consequences, subtle but profound. My relationship with the community changed. Neighbors who had once been indifferent began respecting boundaries more carefully. The line between privacy and intrusion became clearer, and people were more cautious about crossing it. I felt a renewed sense of control over my own life. The control that had been threatened by months of clandestine theft was now restored. Stronger than before, At the same time, I learned to balance vigilance with empathy. Karen's actions were indefensible, but understanding the motivations behind entitlement and manipulation provided clarity. People overstep boundaries for many reasons: insecurity, greed, jealousy, or simply ignorance. Recognizing this didn't excuse her actions, but it helped me approach the situation strategically rather than emotionally, ensuring that every step I took was deliberate and effective. The mountain itself, once a neutral backdrop, became part of the narrative of triumph. The landscape that had been witness to months of theft and tension now served as a reminder of resilience and preparation. Every tree, every ridge, every solar panel and sensor became part of the story of defense, vigilance, and eventual vindication. The sanctuary I had built, threatened and tested, had endured, stronger, safer, and wiser. By the time the legal proceedings concluded, Karen had been convicted on multiple counts. Fines, restitution, and probation ensured that she would bear the consequences of her actions for years. The mountain community had collectively witnessed justice served, and the lessons were absorbed not just by me, but by all who lived there. Boundaries mattered. Preparation mattered. Accountability mattered. For me personally, the ordeal prompted broader reflection. Independence is a precious gift, but it is not immune to challenge. Rights are only as secure as the willingness to defend them. Months of careful preparation, calm confrontation, and methodical documentation had turned what could have been a disaster into a decisive victory. That realization was empowering. A reminder that vigilance and persistence are as critical as any physical security measure. In the weeks and months that followed, life began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The solar panels hummed steadily, the wind turbine rotated predictably, and the generator rested silently. I resumed routines, walked trails, and enjoyed the mountain sunsets with a renewed sense of peace. But the memory of the months-long theft remained vivid. A reminder of what can happen when entitlement meets opportunity, and of what it takes to protect what is yours. I also began sharing my experience with others, quietly helping neighbors and friends understand the importance of proactive security, careful documentation, and assertive defense of property rights. The story of Karen's theft became a guidepost for others navigating isolated living, off-grid systems, and small communities. Knowledge became a tool, not just for protection, but for empowerment. Ultimately, the resolution of the conflict was not just about stopping Karen or reclaiming stolen power. It was about restoring order, reclaiming control, and reinforcing the boundaries that protect independence. Justice was served, community awareness increased, and my own sense of security was strengthened beyond what it had been before. The ordeal had been intense, exhausting, and emotionally draining, but it also revealed the importance of preparation, patience, and steadfast resolve in the face of audacity. The lasting impact extended beyond the immediate consequences. Karen's attempts at manipulation had failed spectacularly, but the lessons endured. Trust must be earned, boundaries must be respected, and vigilance is essential. For anyone living in a remote community, off-grid cabin, or even just navigating interpersonal dynamics, the story served as a vivid example of how careful documentation, calm strategy, and determination can turn a threatening situation into a decisive victory. Looking back, the incident reshaped my perspective on independence, responsibility, and resilience. The mountain, once a passive backdrop, had become a proving ground. A place where audacity met accountability, and where preparation met opportunity. Karen's theft, once a source of fear and frustration, became a catalyst for growth, awareness, and strengthened defenses. And as I watched the sun rise over the ridge months later, my property fully restored, secure, and functioning without interference, one thought lingered. How many people live under the illusion that audacity alone can overcome accountability, only to discover too late that the truth always finds a way to catch up? That question, echoing across the mountain, became the ultimate takeaway: entitlement can only carry someone so far, and when it collides with preparation, documentation, and unwavering resolve, justice prevails. The mountain had taught me that lesson. Painfully, thoroughly, and irrevocably. And for anyone else facing audacity or boundary violations, the message was clear: stand firm, document relentlessly, and let the consequences land where they belong. The ordeal had ended, but the story would live on, a reminder of vigilance, resilience, and the enduring power of truth.